Hi, and welcome to another Wednesday's Word. Today we're looking at Titus chapter 1. Titus is a great book. I love the pastoral epistles, not just because I'm a pastor, but I find them so practical. Sometimes it can get easy to get lost in all the doctrine and arguments, and Paul's being so straightforward in these very brief books. In Titus 1, he's setting Titus. I always picture Titus as this buff, young, strapping guy. Timothy had his weak stomach and some anxiety, so I see those two as those character types, but who knows? We just know that Titus was sent to Crete, which was a tough place, to finish what was undone and appoint elders. And while he was there, he was also called to rebuke those who failed to do good. And in some harsh words, but Paul says that there's many rebellious people full of meaningless talk and deception, especially those of the circumcision group. They must be silenced because they're disturbing whole households by teaching things that ought not to be taught for the sake of dishonest gain. And so he's talking about theological error, and he's not saying, well, let's just tolerate them, let's just agree to disagree. He's saying that this is important stuff, and they're disrupting households. They're after dishonest gain, but they're distorting who God is. And that's why he moves into that whole thing where one of Cretan's own prophets said, Cretans are always liars and evil brutes and lazy gluttons, and this is true. Therefore, rebuke them sharply so that they will be sound in the faith. Here's the thing. The Cretans believed a series of lies. Back in the day, they had this thought that the Greek gods, if you know the movie Hercules or any of that, that whole set of deities came from Crete. And who knows if they actually believed that, but that was the attitude that they portrayed to the world, that the Cretans were better than everyone else on the Aegean Sea, that the Greeks were ruled by just everyday average Cretans. When Zeus and Hera and all them died, they were sent back to Crete, buried, new people went and ruled the world in their stead. And so the Cretans walked around like they were better than everybody else. If you ask them, who's God? Their answer would be us, me. And while today we don't believe in Zeus and Hera and Hercules, we do often believe that we're the lords of our own world. You ask most people, who's God? They're not going to say the God of the Bible. They're not going to say Zeus. They might not say anything. They might say they don't believe in God. But their essential deity, the de facto source of authority, is themselves. That's true in the church also. I know many people who come to church faithfully, but when it comes to tough social issues and issues of moral clarity, they have their own sense of what's right or wrong. They don't submit themselves to the leadership of God. And so when they act like they are God, they live a lie. And that lie always turns into bad action. So for Cretans, they're always liars, lying about being God. That makes them evil brutes and lazy gluttons. Psalm 14 says, the fool says in their heart that there is no God. And their deceit and evil begins to grow from there. So that's the root. A.W. Tozer once said that the most important thing about any of us is what comes to our mind when we think about God. And I think most people in America and in the global West, when they think about God, they think me. But if we think of God as holy, as sovereign, and also of loving and as compassionate, someone who cares for the poor but also is elevated and holy, then we have to stop and be humble and say, okay, if I'm not God, then as I deal with these tough social issues about same-sex marriage, about abortion, about how to handle immigrants, all these issues that are plaguing our country right now, it's not what's my goal, what's my political alliance, it's who's God and how does he step into this? It also comes true to my own mentality. It's not just about dealing with things out there, it's dealing with things in my own heart. So as I get frustrated, I deal with bitterness and regret and just want to be right sometimes. I have to step back and say, hey, I'm not God of my house. I'm not God of my marriage. I'm not God in any of those circumstances. I'm God's servant for my marriage, for my household, for these things. And so having that mentality will change the way I enter those relationships. And so the most important thing about us is how we think of God. But here's the gospel. See, that's not exactly true. C.S. Lewis read A.W. Tozer. That book was called The Knowledge of the Holy. And he wrote a brief response. And he's not really putting Tozer in his place, but he just gives a helpful reminder. He says, while the most important thing about us might be close to what we think about, what comes to our mind when we think of God, the ultimately most important thing about any of us is what comes into God's mind when he thinks of us. And so he thinks of us as chosen and as loved and as his sons and daughters. And so today, if you're struggling with whatever you're struggling with, then remember that the goal of reading the Bible and participating in things like Wednesday's Word and all the study that you're doing is to make sure that when you think of God, you've got the most realistic picture as possible. But also rest in the fact that when God thinks of you, he sees love. All right, that's all I've got for this week. Have a great one.